It's not about you. It's about Jesus. This is what my New Testament professor would tell us about the story of the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is not about you. It's about who Jesus is, Dr. Brosend would say. And yes, he's right. This mountaintop moment marks the end of the season of Epiphany, a season that is all about who Jesus is. From the wise men bearing gifts to water turned into wine to a net overflowing with an abundance of fish, we have been catching glimpses all season of who Jesus is. And here at the end of Epiphany, in this story of the Transfiguration, on a mountaintop, a thin place between earth and heaven, Jesus is changed. His face changes, and his clothes change, and God's voice comes from the clouds, naming Jesus as God's Son, God's chosen, and commanding Jesus' followers to listen to him. I agree with my professor. The Transfiguration is not all about us. It's about who Jesus is. And at the same time, we are invited into this story. Because Jesus being transfigured, being changed here on the mountain, biblical scholars name this as a kind of preview of the resurrection. Because if we remember, in the stories about Jesus' resurrection appearances, his followers do not recognize him at first. He looks different after the resurrection. His face is changed, transfigured. After the resurrection, the disciples on the road to Emmaus do not know who Jesus is until he breaks bread at table with them. After the resurrection, Mary Magdalene thinks Jesus is the gardener. The Transfiguration and the resurrection are moments of profound change for Jesus and for his followers. They are threshold moments. So just as Jesus invites us into the mystery of the resurrection, he invites us also into this preview, the Transfiguration, to wonder with his disciples what this threshold moment might mean. Because we too, in the church calendar, are at a threshold moment. The ending of the Epiphany season and the beginning of Lent, with Ash Wednesday just a few days away. What might we make of this seasonal threshold, this invitation into transformation in our own lives? I was listening this week to a rerun of an episode of the podcast On Being, where host Krista Tippett interviews the Irish poet and theologian John O'Donoghue, who is steeped in the Christian mystical tradition. I commend this podcast episode to you this week, as O'Donoghue actually uses the word transfigure several times during the conversation, and also because he speaks into this current threshold moment we are in, not only in our church calendar, but in our community life as we regather together again here at church. I want to share just a few quotes with you from the podcast. O'Donoghue says, "Threshold, if you go back to the etymology, the meaning of the word comes from threshen, which is to separate the grain from the husk. So the threshold, in a way, is a place where you move into more critical and challenging and worthy fullness." This quote reminds me of Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of John when he says, Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. How is our current threshold moment asking us to change? In the words of John O'Donohue, what husk must we leave behind in order to move into challenging fullness? Or in Jesus' words, what may need to die in order for us to bear much fruit? Here's another quote about thresholds from O'Donohue. When we cross a new threshold, if we cross worthily, what we do is we heal the patterns of repetition that were in us, that had us caught somewhere, and in our crossing, then we cross on to new ground where we don't just repeat what we've been through in the last place we were. In these last years of a continuing pandemic, we as individuals and as a community here at Grace have undergone profound changes, and not ones we would necessarily choose. We are not the same as we were before the pandemic, as individuals or as a community. There is grief in this, and there is loss, and there is also gift and opportunity and spaciousness for something new to break through if we can listen together, gently and patiently, and be open to the questions that this threshold moment offers. How have we been changed? How are we being changed even now? How are we different than we were? And how, in this threshold moment of regathering, do we cross into a new season together with space to grieve what has been lost, and also the courage and patience and spaciousness to listen to Jesus for what we are being called to become? We are given the gift in our Christian tradition of these changes of liturgical seasons, and of these stories like the Transfiguration, of these threshold moments that we get to return to and walk through together and be changed by year after year. Each year, when we come to this threshold before Lent, each year when we stand on the mountaintop with the disciples in wonder and awe at who Jesus is, we have an opportunity to climb down the mountain and cross the threshold into Lent in a way that is open to God's healing, open to God's transforming power, and open to God's command to listen to Jesus, the transfigured one. Here are some open-ended questions we might ponder this week. How would we like to cross this threshold into Lent this year? What are our hearts yearning for as we descend the mountain with the disciples? What are we being called to do or not do in order to obey God's command to listen, to really listen to Jesus? How do we stay open to the healing and transforming power of this transfigured one, this resurrected one? Another approaching threshold is the change from winter to spring. The bulbs underground are being transfigured into snowdrops, into crocuses. You can look for them in the garden on your way out from church today, although they may be covered and insulated by a layer of snow at the moment. But do look for them and be inspired by these green fingers pushing their way up through the dark, fertile soil that has held and nourished their bulbs all winter. These small, brave signs of transfiguration, of resurrection. In honor of these multiple thresholds where we stand together, let's close with a poem by Lucille Clifton. It's called Spring Song. The green of Jesus is breaking the ground, and the sweet smell of delicious Jesus is opening the house, and the dance of Jesus' music has hold of the air, and the world is turning in the body of Jesus, and the future is possible. Amen.